Welcome back to another deep dive, listeners. Today we're taking a look at a giant, a titan even Proclus of Athens, 5th century CE, head honcho at the Platonic Academy for almost 50 years?
You got it, the main man for Platonic thought in those late ancient times. Essentially the bridge from Plato himself to the Middle Ages.
So huge shoes to fill, right? But not just that, this guy was prolific. We're talking commentaries on Aristotle, Euclid, massive amounts of Plato, all offering his unique insights and interpretations.
He didn't stop there either. Proclus also developed entire philosophical systems on, everything. Metaphysics, theology, physics, astronomy, math, even ethics. Plus, he got into those more mystical traditions too. Orphism, the Chaldean oracles, the whole shebang.
Right, so this is not going to be a quick dip. It's a deep, deep dive, people. And we want to tailor this exploration for our philosopher listeners out there. Today, we're going for the core of Proclus's system, the ideas that still resonate with philosophical inquiry even today.
And the first thing any philosopher should know is that understanding Proclus means navigating a bit of a historical maze. Our main sources are his works, obviously, but also his biography by his student, Marinus.
Plus, we get some scattered but intriguing remarks from Damascus, another figure from that late Neoplatonic scene.
Exactly. It's like piecing together a puzzle. And here's another piece to consider. Proclus had this really close intellectual relationship with his teacher, Syrianus. They studied together for 6 years. And Proclus never criticizes Syrianus in his writing.
So teasing out their separate contributions is tricky.
It's like trying to figure out which artist painted which part of a canvas when two masters collaborated.
Okay, so let's jump in. Metaphysics and theology, those seem like the ground floor for Proclus, right?
Absolutely. He built his entire system on that Neoplatonic foundation laid down by Plotinus and Iamblichus. We've got that classic hierarchy, the one, intellect, and soul.
Each level having its own way of being and acting, right?
Right, and that's key for understanding Proclus. It's this emanation, this overflowing of reality from that ultimate source, the one. But he adds a cool wrinkle, and that's the noetonoleron, the intelligible intellective.
Okay, now that sounds like a mouthful. Break it down for the philosophy folks out there. What's the significance?
Proclus, always the meticulous philosopher, he wanted to really distinguish between to noeton, the intelligible realm, the objects of pure thought, and to know Eron, the active intellect itself that grasps those objects.
So you're saying it's like a bridge between those two realms?
Yeah, a bridge between static being and dynamic thought. It's both being intelligized and actively intelligizing. Earlier Neoplatonists kind of hinted at this, but Proclus, he turns it into a distinct level of reality, a hypostasis. It gives us a deep understanding of how being and thought are connected.
Always looking for that deeper connection. Now there's this other big Proclus concept, the triad of triads. That's moni, prohodos, epistrophe, remaining, proceeding, and reverting.
For Proclus, this is like the fundamental law of causality, how causes relate to their effects.
So what's the core insight here for philosophers grappling with the idea of causality?
Proclus says in his Elements of Theology that every effect remains in its cause. They share some fundamental nature. But it also proceeds from its cause, becomes distinct. And then it reverts back in some way.
A kind of cosmic dance between the cause and effect.
Exactly. It's a constant movement of remaining, going forth, and returning. If it didn't proceed, there would be no distinction between cause and effect. And if it didn't revert, there'd be no order, no coherence in reality.
It's a beautiful idea, this interconnectedness, this dance of existence. Now, Proclus also has a fascinating take on Plato's theory of forms. He introduces this triad, the unparticipated, participated, and participating.
This is how Proclus tackles the problem of universals and particulars, one of the big ones in philosophy.
Right. How can a single form exist in all these different instances without being fragmented?
Exactly. So we've got the unparticipated form. It's pure, transcendent, doesn't get mixed up with individuals. Then there's the participated. These are the individual things that share some likeness of the form.
But how do they connect?
That's where the participating level comes in. It's the intermediary, the vehicle that allows the unparticipated form to be present in the participated things.
So the unparticipated stays pure, but its essence can still shine through.
Exactly. It's how Proclus keeps the transcendence and unity of the forms while explaining how they manifest in our world. It's a direct response to some of the critiques Aristotle had of Plato.
I was going to address those critiques. Okay, now for something a bit more, mystical. Proclus and his Henads.
Ah, yes. This is where Proclus integrates Greek polytheistic religion with his Neoplatonic metaphysics.
Some philosophers might be a bit wary of that.
Oh, for sure. But for Proclus, these henads, these unities or gods, they're not just mythological figures. He sees them as necessary ontological links.
Links between what?
Between that utterly transcendent one and the vast multiplicity of the world. Think of them like rungs on a ladder, mediating between the highest divine realm and everything else.
They bring divine influence and order to all levels of reality.
That's the idea. It's his way of saying that philosophy can accommodate and explain the objects of religious veneration.
An ambitious project, for sure. Let's move on to causality. Proclus makes this distinction between auxiliary instrumental causes and true causes. Help us unpack that for a philosophical mind.
Sure. The big difference is in the source and power of the cause. Auxiliary causes, like Aristotle's material and formal causes, they're part of the process, but they don't have the primary power to bring about the effect.
So they're like tools or ingredients.
Yeah, kind of. True causes, on the other hand, they act from a higher level. They transcend their effects. Proclus is saying that while Aristotle's four causes work well for understanding things down here in the world of change,
They don't get to the ultimate explanation.
exactly, he thinks Plato goes deeper. He points to the transcendent forms, the blueprint for existence. Then there's the demiurge, the divine craftsman who actually makes the cosmos.
The efficient cause.
Right. And ultimately there's the good, the final cause, the ultimate aim of everything.
So for Proclus, Plato's giving us the why behind existence, not just the how.
You got it. He criticizes Aristotle for rejecting the forms, for not fully accounting for the being of things, only their movement and change.
And I'm guessing he wasn't a fan of Aristotle's idea of spontaneous generation either?
Not at all. He saw that as limiting the power of efficient causality. For Proclus, everything must ultimately come from the intentional activity of the demiurge.
So no self-creating world for Proclus.
Nope. And this leads him to this pretty radical idea, taken from Platonist: only incorporeal beings can be true causes.
Okay, now that's a big one, especially for philosophers thinking about the mind-body problem. What are the implications here?
Well, in Elements of Theology, Proclus lays it out. Corporeal beings are passive, they receive, they change. True causes, they have to be active, they can't be changed themselves in the process. That means they have to be incorporeal.
So the soul, which is incorporeal, can act on the body, which is corporeal, but not the other way around.
Right, it reinforces that hierarchy of reality. The incorporeal is superior, it's the source of true activity.
It's a pretty clear challenge to materialist views of the world.
Definitely. And to top it off, Proclus presents this idea of threefold existence. It's a way of enriching our understanding of what it means to exist.
Okay, break it down for us.
Proclus says things exist in themselves, causally, and as participated. Existing in itself is about a thing's intrinsic nature, its essence. Existing causally means it exists in a more perfect form in its cause.
Oh, like a blueprint.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
And finally, existing as participator describes how that essence manifests in its effects.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, think about life. Life exists as the defining characteristic of the soul in itself. It also exists as a perfect form in the divine intellect, the cause of all life that's causally.
And then individual living things have life by participating in that higher form.
Exactly. It shows how everything is interconnected, how everything derives its being from higher principles.
It's a beautiful, intricate web of existence. Now let's turn to Proclus's view of the soul itself.
Yeah.
How does he approach psychology and the way we come to know?
He dives right in, stating the soul is not just some byproduct of the body. It's self-moving, incorporeal, separable, and immortal.
Big claims right off the bat.
Proclus isn't messing around. And just like with everything else, there's a hierarchy of souls, ranging from the divine and demonic all the way down to the human and animal.
Emanating from that unparticipated soul monad.
You know it. And of course, he tackles the classic Platonic idea of the fall of the soul, but he adds his own twist.
What's that?
He introduces these vehicles of the soul. The rational soul always stays in a luminous vehicle. The non-rational soul gets a pneumatic one. And when the soul comes into the body, it picks up this material, shell-like vehicle.
Vehicles like containers for the soul.
Yeah, think of them like that. They connect the soul to the body, allow it to move and sense, and even explain experiences after death.
So even in death, the soul's journey continues.
That's the idea. He sticks with the Platonic idea of transmigration, but he makes it clear that human souls don't go into animal bodies as their main form. That's reserved for animal souls.
Keeping that hierarchy intact. Okay, what about how the soul actually knows things?
Proclus lays out this hierarchy of cognitive faculties, starting with sense perception and moving up through imagination, opinion, doxa, discursive thought, dianoia, to pure intellection, nous. The goal is to ascend to that direct understanding of the intelligible realm.
So a classic ascent towards knowledge.
Totally. And like Plato, Proclus is all about innate knowledge, the idea of anamnesis recollection. He says the soul has these innate reason principles, logoi, which are also forms, idei.
They're like preloaded knowledge in the soul.
Exactly. But they're not just subjective, they're the fundamental principles governing reality itself. He even calls them essential reason principles, logoi ousiades.
So the way we think reflects the very structure of being.
That's it. Proclus argues that we can only even make meaningful statements about the world because we have these innate concepts. He's careful to distinguish these from the transcendent Platonic forms, which he sees as more like intelligible particulars.
And from those individualized universals in matter.
Right. The universality and objectivity of our concepts come from this idea that all souls share the same logoi. So understanding these logoi is like understanding the true causes of reality.
It's like Aristotle's idea that knowing something means knowing its cause.
Exactly. Now, Proclus also makes this important distinction between opinion and discursive thought.
Help us grasp that one.
Think about seeing an apple. Opinion is just recognizing that it is an apple. Discursive thought goes further. It explains why it's an apple, its properties, its place in the world.
So opinion is surface level, and discursive thought digs deeper.
Yep. And this leads Proclus to completely reject the idea of the mind as a blank slate.
No tabula rasa for Proclus.
Definitely not. He's firmly against that Aristotelian view. He says the soul must have knowledge inherently, even if we forget it because of the trauma of birth.
Kind of like Plato's cave allegory.
It's similar. For Proclus, the soul contains all things, all logoi in actuality, not just potentially. He says the soul is not an unwritten tablet, but one that's always being inscribed by the intellect itself.
A pretty powerful image.
Right, and he takes this further, offering detailed critiques of abstractionism, the idea that we get our knowledge from the senses alone.
And he does all this in his commentaries on Plato's Parmenides and Euclid's Elements.
Exactly. So for Proclus, learning is less about acquiring new knowledge and more about remembering what's already within us.
It's about uncovering the truth that's already there. Now, let's dive into Proclus's ethics. This is where we get into those big questions that philosophers are still wrestling with today. Providence, fate, free choice, and evil.
Proclus didn't shy away from these tough topics. He even wrote separate books on them. For him, providence pronoia is that benevolent activity coming from the one and flowing through the haenads, the gods.
So it's the divine guiding hand.
Yeah, you could say that. But then there's this apparent conflict with human freedom. If the divine knows everything in advance, do we really have free choice? It's the classic determinism problem.
The tough one for sure. What's Proclus's solution?
He argues that the way we know things is determined by the knower, not the object being known. So even if future events are contingent, the gods know them in a non-contingent, eternal way.
So their knowledge doesn't force those events to happen.
Exactly. It just apprehends them as they will freely occur. It's a subtle distinction, but it allows Proclus to reconcile divine omniscience with human agency.
A neat philosophical maneuver. But what about fate? How does that fit in?
Well, Proclus is all about making distinctions. He says, providence is the activity of the divine itself, while fate is a lower dependent power. It's like a manifestation of providence.
So there's a hierarchy there.
Always with Proclus. He also distinguishes between the rational soul, which is guided by providence, and the irrational soul, which is more bound to fate.
So our capacity for reason gives us some freedom.
Yes, exactly. By aligning ourselves with reason, we can potentially rise above the determinism of fate. And then, of course, there's the problem of evil.
The big one. How does Proclus deal with that within his otherwise optimistic worldview?
He makes this really interesting argument. He says evil doesn't have its own independent existence. It's not a thing in itself. Instead, it has a parasitic existence, hypostasis.
Parasitic on what?
On the good. For Proclus, true existence comes from a cause acting intentionally towards a good end. Evil, he says, is a deficiency, a privation, an unintended consequence.
It's like darkness, the absence of light.
That's a great analogy. He says evil arises because we're moving further away from the perfect unity of the one. It's a byproduct of emanation.
So evil is not a force in its own right. It's a consequence of limitation, of falling short of the good.
Exactly, and this concept had a huge influence on later thinkers, especially Dionysius the Areopagite.
So evil exists, but it's not something ultimately real in the Proclus sense. Now, let's move on to how Proclus viewed the physical world. How does he approach physics, astronomy, and math?
Well, he sees the study of nature as a kind of theological physics. Unlike Aristotle, who focused on movement and change, Proclus wants to trace everything back to its divine causes.
He's looking for that divine blueprint behind the physical world.
Yeah, you could say that. For him, Plato's Timaeus is superior to Aristotelian physics because it gives us both physiologia, an account of nature, and theologia, an explanation grounded in divine principles.
So, for Proclus, nature is an expression of the divine mind.
Exactly. And when it comes to time and eternity, he draws this sharp line between temporal existence, which is all about before and after, and the eternal, which is a simultaneous whole.
Like a timeless snapshot.
Kind of. And he goes further, distinguishing between absolute time and participated times.
Absolute time being the time of the one.
Right. And participated times being the time we experience down here in the world. And it's the same for eternity. Eternity is how we measure eternal beings, while time is how we measure temporal beings.
But then he talks about perpetuity, aidietes, which has both eternal and temporal forms. How does that work?
Well, he uses this to explain things like the universe and the celestial spheres. They exist eternally in the sense that they never began and they'll never end.
But they also change over time.
Right. So they're eternal in one sense, but they also unfold through time. And it's the same for souls. They're immortal, so they have eternity, but they also experience change and growth within time.
It's like they're participating in both eternity and time.
Exactly. And this leads to his disagreement with Aristotle about the eternity of the world.
Right. Aristotle thought the world was ungenerated and eternal.
Yeah, but Proclus argues that while the world is eternal in a sense, it's also generated. As a corporeal thing, it can't exist on its own forever. It needs a higher cause.
And that higher cause is what makes it generated.
Right, so it's both eternal and generated. He's drawing on Plato's idea of the demiurge, the divine craftsman who creates the world.
So for Proclus, the world is a creation, not just something that's always been there.
Exactly. He thinks Aristotle missed the mark because he rejected Plato's forms, those eternal, unchanging blueprints for reality.
So it's a fundamental disagreement about the ultimate nature of reality.
Exactly. Now, what about those celestial bodies? What's Proclus's take on them?
Fill us in.
Well, he agrees with Aristotle that there's a fifth nature out there, something different from the four elements we have down here. But he says the celestial realm is still made of those four elements.
Which is in a more refined way.
Right, a superior mode. And fire is the dominant element up there. It's like Plato's Timaeus.
So there's continuity between the celestial and the earthly realm.
Exactly. But then there's the question of place. Does the universe have a place?
It's a weird thing to think about.
It is. Aristotle defined place as the boundary of the surrounding body.
So the universe, having nothing surrounding it, wouldn't have a place.
Right. But Proclus, drawing on Plato's Republic, says place is actually this immaterial body, a kind of immobile light.
So the universe can have a place even though there's nothing physically surrounding it.
Exactly. It's a clever way to resolve that paradox. Now, when it comes to astronomy, Proclus distinguishes between two approaches.
Lay them out for us.
First, there's observational or mathematical astronomy. Think guys like Aristarchus, Hipparchus, and Ptolemy. They're all about developing models to describe and predict the movements of celestial bodies.
So it's a more empirical approach.
Right. But then there's the philosophical approach, which Proclus prefers. It's about understanding the deeper, intelligible causes behind those movements.
So it's about the why, not just the how.
Exactly. He draws on Plato, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, all those who saw the cosmos as imbued with intelligence and purpose.
So he explains the movement of the planets through the agency of souls.
Yeah, intelligent souls that are themselves moved by the forms.
So even the heavens are participating in the eternal realm of the forms.
Right. While he appreciates Ptolemy's mathematical models, he doesn't think they tell the whole story.
They don't get to the heart of what the cosmos really is.
Exactly. And his philosophy of math follows a similar line. He rejects the idea that math comes from abstracting from sensory experience.
He thinks mathematical objects have a higher reality.
Absolutely. He says they primarily exist in the intellect and secondarily in souls as logo.
So they're like those innate reason principles we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But our imagination gives them extension and particularity so we can actually visualize them.
So geometry is not just about shapes on a page.
Right. It's about those eternal, unchanging forms that exist in the divine mind.
It's a way of ascending to a higher understanding of reality.
That's the goal. Now, all of this leads us to theology, a fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of Proclus's thought.
For our philosopher listeners who might be unfamiliar with this, can you give us a quick overview of theurgy?
Theurgy is about actively engaging with the divine through ritual. It's about using specific practices to establish a direct connection with the divine realm.
It's like a mystical practice.
You could say that. For Proclus, the ultimate goal of philosophy is homoiosis theoi, becoming like God.
It's that classic Platonic ideal.
Right. But within Neoplatonism, there was a debate about how to achieve this. Some, like Plotinus and Porphyry, emphasize intellectual and contemplative assent.
So it's all about understanding.
Right. But others, like Iamblichus, Syrianus, and Proclus, championed theurgy.
They thought you needed something more than just thinking.
Exactly. They believed the soul fully descends into the body, so you need these special rituals to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine.
Rituals that were divinely revealed.
That's the idea. Proclus thought the power of theurgy was immense, even surpassing human knowledge.
So it's not about coercing the gods.
No, not at all. It's about aligning yourself with the divine, making yourself receptive to divine influence.
And what did these theurgic rituals involve?
They often used symbola or synthemata, material symbols that corresponded to divine principles, and they invoked secret divine names.
It's like using language as a tool for spiritual transformation.
Exactly. Proclus even connected theurgy to Plato's idea of eros, love, as a way of moving toward the divine.
So love is a kind of theurgic force.
In a way, yes. It's that longing for the divine that drives us upward. And Proclus himself engaged in different kinds of theurgy.
Like what?
Well, there's the animation of statues, influencing physical phenomena through ritual. Then there's using hymns and invocations to ascend to the higher realms.
Like the hymns he wrote himself.
Exactly. And finally, there's the ultimate goal, achieving union with the one itself.
It's a mystical journey toward the source of all being.
You could say that. Now, even though the Neoplatonic school eventually declined, Proclus's influence didn't disappear.
His ideas found a way to persist.
Right. He was a major influence on Byzantine thinkers, and his ideas even seeped into Christian thought.
Yes.
Well, Dionysius the Areopagite, a Christian writer, was heavily influenced by Proclus. His works were super popular in the Middle Ages and brought Proclan ideas into Christianity.
So Proclus was having an impact even within a different religious tradition.
Exactly. And then there's the Liber de Causis. It's an Arabic adaptation of Proclus's Elements of Theology.
But people thought it was by Aristotle.
I know, right? It was a huge text in medieval universities, even studied by Thomas Aquinas.
Talk about a hidden influence.
Right. It shows how Proclus's ideas were circulating even when people didn't realize it. And then in the Renaissance, we see a resurgence of interest in Proclus.
He was rediscovered.
Exactly. Figures like Marsilio Ficino translated his works and brought his ideas back into the spotlight. And that interest has continued to this day.
So Proclus is still relevant to philosophers today.
Absolutely. He's a challenging and rewarding thinker, someone who grapples with the biggest questions of existence.
And his system, his attempt to synthesize philosophy with religion and mysticism, offers a unique perspective on reality.
It's a comprehensive vision that's worth exploring, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
And that brings us to our final thought for our listeners. Proclus offers us this incredibly grand, interconnected vision of reality. How can contemporary philosophers in our increasingly specialized world engage with such comprehensive systems of thought?
It's a challenge, for sure, but it's a challenge worth taking on. Proclus reminds us that philosophy is not just about analyzing concepts. It's about understanding the whole, about connecting the dots between different areas of knowledge.
It's about that search for wisdom that goes beyond disciplinary boundaries.
Exactly. So as you continue your own philosophical journey, consider what Proclus has to offer. You might be surprised by what you find.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Proclus. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.